Are we live? Okay.
No, because we have only the 7 of us in the room.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Just keep an eye on that. Let it kind of. They'll open up the gates and.
I'll keep it. Yeah. Keep an eye on it. Okay. Thanks.
You are alive.
We are live. Okay. Great. Welcome panelists and welcome participants who attending ASU GSV conference. We're happy to have you. We are talking about artificial intelligence and its effect and impact on the educational technology communities. I want to welcome all the panelists. We don't do introductions for ASU GSV, but here's my first question. All right. A lot of progress has been made in artificial intelligence and machine learning in education. So how is it changing education? How's your organization, for each of you, leveraging AI or ML to improve student outcomes? And anybody can start, any one of you, unless you want me to call on you. Alina.
Oh, sure. So hi, Jerry and the audience. I'm Alina Fondavier. I'm with Duolingo as the Chief of Assessment. So from my perspective, it's an interesting question because I've been working on blending artificial intelligence with traditional psychometrics for a long time now. Actually, I started around 2012, 2013. So in a way for me, everything that is happening now is also a bit of validation. So here we are talking about artificial intelligence in education and how we combine it for helping both the efficiency of our measurements, supporting learning, but also to change how the things have been done. So obviously, as you all know about Duolingo, everything at Duolingo is using artificial intelligence in a way or another. The Duolingo English test is probably a unique test at the moment. It's the first of its kind as digital first, where all parts of the test development process, scoring, administration, and so on, it's all artificial intelligence based. And of course, the learning app is also artificial intelligence based. So that being said, I would say that some of the companies are really, especially EdTech, are really ready to take advantage of the speed, scale, and also consistency of results that a artificial intelligence supported technology could provide in education. I would let my colleagues add their comments.
Great, thank you. Sergey, how about you?
Hey everyone, my name is Sergey, work at Turnitin, and I came to Turnitin by acquisition of a company called Gradescope, and at Gradescope, still its own product, we assist instructors with the grading task for all kinds of assignments. So assignments that were given out on paper or online assignments, bubble sheets, programming projects. And the role that we see AI play in education, or the role we're trying to make, true in education, is essentially a virtual teaching assistant. The AI be an assistant for the instructor in performing certain tasks, such as grading. It's very important that the instructor has ultimate responsibility for how they choose to do grading and how they want to educate their students. So the AI does not, replace the grading functionality. It assists the instructor in grading. So for instance, the AI might group student answers into groups, and then the instructor will decide how to grade each group. And that saves them a lot of time because they don't have to see the same answer more than once, but it doesn't remove any agency that they have. They still decide how to grade each answer and how much feedback to provide.
Great. Andreas, how are you?
Yeah, so I want to first sort of state that I don't think actually that AI does anything on its own. It's actually people have different needs, and those needs due to COVID, etc., have really elevated the kind of needs that AI responds to. But in the end, it's a tool. It is not a self-propelling thing. It is the human need that drives what we develop and try to find AI tools for. You know, ETS has been, in terms of how it has changed us, we have been developing these scoring engines since actually the mid-90s, believe it or not. I think what has changed for us is a far more laser sharp focus on using AI responsibly, as opposed to just throwing AI at everything and hoping something sticks. And so we've been really focused from the beginning, but more so than ever in, is it a fair use? Is it traceable? And it goes very much back to what Sergey is saying about the role of the teacher. That is an incredibly important part of making sure that your AI works well, because that is in the end where the responsibility is. And so it needs to help the teaching, or it has to help the student or the parent, but it cannot take over, because then you lose that very important check on whether it does it right. And as we know from the news, AI gets it wrong a lot of times, especially when the stakes are high.
Thanks, Andres. And Lev, how about you?
Well, hi, everybody. Great to be able to join you. And thanks to my colleagues from the technology companies who are here. And I am Lev Gonick, Arizona State University's Chief Information Officer. And so by design, we actually have a different perspective to be offering in this conversation about the future of AI. And I think that traditionally, vendors in the space are bringing products that are machine learning and AI advertised have been trying for the last 10 years, as the marketplace gets established, to try to do the near impossible, which is, we're actually incredibly disruptive, but don't worry, we're not actually taking anyone's jobs or taking anyone's sort of function away. And the truth is, it probably is possible to thread that needle, but the sort of I think we've come to a point where we need to continue to have dialogues inside the university about what machine learning and AI actually is doing to support the viability of the institution, the experience of the students, the role of the professors. And I think that the time has really come to take a look at really sort of the storytelling that we do around it. Universities can, of course, buy solutions, as have been evidenced by three great products that have been shared already, and many more in the marketplace. Or, as we've been doing at ASU, and maybe still a little ahead of the curve, after all, that is kind of what we're all about at ASU, we've been kind of growing it on our own and rolling it on our own. And so, I mean, if I could just, Jerry, just share that at a high level, we've been using machine learning and AI, especially during COVID, in critically important ways. We literally have 3 million self-attestations of students since August 10th about their symptoms. And we're using machine learning to figure out what, if any, predictive value does that actually have using machine learning. We have tens of thousands of actual tests that are in our own databases, trying to, again, make students aware that being at a university, we're actually in a unique position to both help them understand the sort of the general context of what it means to be going to school during a global pandemic, but also to support a kind of management strategy to make them and the faculty and their families actually fairly, I hope, feeling fairly confident that we're using the technology that they would expect us to in order to deliver and manage. And even questions around dispersion and transfer of the disease. I start with this rather than kind of going, how do we specifically handle student success in the traditional sense? Because student success today starts with, what is it that I'm going to university for, and how do I know that it's safe? And how do I know that the university is actually really in a position to create a unique value proposition? So at ASU, we've partnered with the Mayo Clinic. We're using our own technologies. We're using our own testing environment. We're testing whether or not it's R naught as a way of describing descriptions, or whether it's a K dispersion. Those are things that really help students kind of go, all right, I can perhaps begin to actually reduce my anxiety and my fear, because I know the university is using technology in that way. And if they are using technology to help me feel better about my approach to going to school during COVID. What else are they doing? And so it turns out that, again, we have millions of data points at ASU Online, having been now in this space for 11 years, millions of data points, which allow us to very, very carefully and literally surgically predict when and where, on what courses, on what weeks, and in what sessions there are likely to be challenges based on essentially, again, this massive data pool of learning data that we have. We're using adaptive technology all the time, which is to say, rather than simply delivering education in a traditional way, we're using our own tools to allow us to use test results and other assessments to determine what students are able to do on their own. And then we're using that adaptive technology engine to help students actually begin to explore and hopefully become mastery of things that they don't know, rather than simply demonstrating the things that they do know. So more to say, but I kind of wanted to frame that in my mind, the conversation about the value of AI in this moment in time, we should not separate the power of AI to advance our scientific understanding of the COVID pandemic with the same underlying technologies, engines, and insights that can be gained to help students succeed. And after all, at least in the education world, that's what we're all about.
Thank you, Lev. That was great. Here's the the rhino in the room, COVID-19. How do you think COVID is changing or accelerating, or I don't want to bias you, but how do you think it's changing technology in education? How do you think it's changing education? And what's going to be left after this, after we get a vaccine next year, hopefully? How will all of that change? So Andreas, how about starting with you?
Sure. Yeah, so I think one of the things that I think all of us here are principally worried about is the widening of the gap, because technology is an additional lens that will widen, those who have and those who have not. And so what do we do to close that gap? And I know there are some examples that probably some of my fellow panelists can talk about of how we can actually use it for good, because one of the ways that it may help is that some of these AI powered self-learning tools actually become a help for students who would otherwise be left behind in other ways. But we cannot forget that the student who has to share that one computer with 3 siblings from home, no AI is going to solve that problem. And that's a problem that's way more important to solve than thinking that AI or machine learning can, ever solve. It's a fundamental problem of equity that I think has come to the fore because of COVID, more than we were aware of before.
Okay. That's good. Yeah. Sergey, how about you?
Well, COVID has resulted in a rapid transition to online courses at a lot of schools, K through 12 and higher ed. And I think that's good and bad. Bad for the reasons Andreas highlighted, bad for some subset of the population. Good in other respects, though. It's good that teachers are discovering tools that have existed, right, or have recently been developed, that they had the motivation or just the opportunity or the need to explore. And now that they're finding these tools, they actually see that it's a better place for them to be in, even outside of COVID. So, I mean, I am talking about tools like Gradescope, for example. You can use it in an offline setting with physical papers. You can also use it in an online setting. In an online setting, you have to use something like that. So that's how you discover it. But even when students go back to physical classrooms, I think a lot of the teachers who've discovered tools like Gradescope will keep using them because it's just a better way to do things than the past. So hopefully, a lot of concerns about the widening gap, like Andrea said. But I think there is a silver lining in that I guess the efficiency of the overall educational system will increase after the students go back to the classroom.
You're right. Yeah. Alina, what do you think?
Well, for Duolingo, evidently, everything that happened in the past 6 months meant an acceleration of both the Duolingo app use and also of the Duolingo English test. Actually, it's quite interesting if you look at analytics over time on the Duolingo, the use of the Duolingo learning app, you can pretty much follow how COVID expanded, moved on from China to the US, which is fascinating because we realize how small is our world, you know, everyone everywhere doing more or less the same thing, in this case, learning languages. So I would say for Duolingo meant a bit of what Sergey said, you know, that some tools were there before, but they were now really discovered or rediscovered at an amazing scale. So for Duolingo, it's really being at the right time, in the right place, with the right tools to help people under those circumstances. From the equity perspective, again, I think it's, you know, of course, if you don't have internet, then it's really hard to talk about any sort of technology being helpful. But even with a little bit of internet, I want to emphasize the use of the Duolingo app for learning different languages by the refugees and by people who are known to have very little resources. And yet, here they are using this free app to improve their chances for employment, for immigration, for making a new life in the countries where they are. So I think there is a significant potential of technology to help the society in general. I think we just need to think a bit more outside the box on how to make things happen. So I agree, of course, with Andreas that for those who do not have any access to internet or just too little to make a difference, it's probably going to be difficult to emphasize or see any progress in their education using technology. But as I said before, even a little bit of access could actually open doors. I'm also a very optimistic person, but looking and being with my new colleagues at Duolingo, that gives me a lot of hope for our society.
Thank you. And Lev, how about your response to the question?
Well, this has been a theme throughout this year's ASU GSV. You know, there are 80 million learners between K to BA in the country, and 50 million of them right now are learning in remote mode or hybrid remote modes that are out there. And approximately 13 million do not have internet access and or do not have a device at home sufficient to be able to conduct, you know, what at the university level, at least, we expect for a baseline. And my view is that, I mean, and I've, you know, been on this soapbox for 25 years yelling as much as I can, because although no one ever wants to advocate a global pandemic, the point is that the availability of broadband and networking devices is at this point obviously not a luxury for education. It's a must-have. And in my view, if not now, when? I think there is a growing consensus that we can solve this together. It will take universities partnering and schools obviously partnering with technology providers, internet providers and device providers along the way. And I also think that, you know, that the silver lining is that there is in fact a growing consensus on it. I do want to suggest, at least from my vantage point, that I don't think that we're actually ever going back. I think a vaccine comes and it continues to sort of shuffle the deck at ASU. And again, I mean, we may not be sort of the mean, you know, we may be somewhat of an outlier, but I actually don't think so much in this respect. I think the market has spoken. I think students have said for a lot of years, you know, we want choice. We want to have as much personalized learning as possible. We want to be efficient with the way of our time. This is not 1950. This is 2020 and beyond. And so as a result, the market wants choice. And I think what COVID has shown us is that notwithstanding all kinds of end of the world scenarios about what would happen if education went online, there are certain circumstances under which not only is it an acceptable fashion, not only is it even a good arrangement, it's actually a better arrangement for certain kinds of use cases and certain kinds of learners. And as a result of it, I think we have a huge opportunity for entrepreneurs, including the colleagues who are on this panel, but certainly throughout the ASU GSV, to think about it in terms of market opportunity to address the adaptive use or perhaps the machine learning specific use of data to help create more choices in the marketplace for just-in-time learning, for pathways into new opportunities as the skill sets needed across the economy continue to shift. These are what entrepreneurs need to do. Again, with a human face, with a full understanding that, of course, with a million people around the world having lost their lives, that's obviously hugely tragic in any sense of the word. But our opportunity here is to take a moment, reflect on it, and then figure out how we can actually support the needs going forward. And again, Jerry, my view is actually not only is there a market interest in this, I also happen to believe that COVID is the introduction of an age of pandemics. That may be a bit sort of a gloomy way to end these remarks right at the moment, but I do think we're entering into an era in which we're going to see variations on this theme for a very long time.
Thank you, Gleb. I tend to agree with you. Yeah, we've had SARS and MERS and now the pandemic. Yeah, so here's the, and our masks may be what we are always wearing now. But we have a question from the audience. Just a second here. Okay, and the question is: higher education is looking at more engagement data to signal student success, especially virtual and in-person engagement. How can AI play a role in student success when it expands beyond just GPA and degree completion? Can it be used for different purposes and success outcomes? What do you all think about that? I can read it again if you'd like.
Jerry, I mean, I'd like to just quickly chime in to give my colleagues plenty of time to respond. I think this is one of the holy grails that is out there. I'd love there to be and I believe certainly knowing, two of the three companies that are on the panel with me today, that there's a huge opportunity to use distributed ledger technologies and other new technologies together with machine learning to make it possible for a learner to show evidence of her or his learning in an authentic way that is added to the GPA and the major going forward. And again, at ASU, we've shared at this event, and we will again next year, the work that we're doing in the Trusted Learner Network, which is our effort to be responsive to the question that you just posed.
Okay.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think, as you say, Lev, it is all about opportunity, because I think what we're finding is that learners are becoming much more consumers, like vocal consumers who have that much more choice. Because in an online world, you can create a lot more choices that are scalable, as opposed to reworking a whole school building within different setups, etc. And so I think that relationship with the learner and making sure that everything is for the learner and that it is learner-centric, in the sense that even decisions about access to certain, to higher ed is still about helping the learner find the best fit. So in a world where there are ostensibly, I think this is the projection, more seats than there are students, and that's already now the case in higher ed, and that will continue to be the case at least for a while, as the millennial generation kind of pulls through and international exchanges become a little bit depressed due to COVID. It becomes much more about the right fit and the right environment for each individual student. And so that personalization and that individualization, that is central there. And that is where AI can really play a major role, especially when it's in a low stakes environment where it's to help inform as opposed to create barriers.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Andres.
And I also believe that engagement, I agree, I agree with the person who asked the question that engagement matters a lot for learning, that it is known that if people are engaged, then the opportunity for engaging with the material as well, it becomes explicit. And definitely the AI tools can help keeping people engaged in a virtual environment. I think that this is definitely one avenue by which this is possible. But Andreas mentioned or separated, or probably I read into what he said, between a low stakes environment, say if you have many opportunities for learning and with appropriate feedback and personalized and so on, versus say a high stake interaction such as an assessment. So I would dare say that even for an assessment that is high stakes, that perhaps the experience of the learner needs to be more taken into account going forward than it has always been before. I think in the past we have had, when I say we, I mean the community in testing industry probably, we have mostly thought about the features of the test and less about whether or how the learner himself interacts with the test. So much less in terms of service and much more in terms of a given product. And I think that needs to change as well. I think we need to expand the notion of service around high stakes assessment as well. There are options nowadays there, and I think the experience of the test takers also needs to be taken into account. Of course, it can never be as engaging as some of the innovative interactive tasks that we have for learning, but it's not just a black and white. There is a continuum there, and I believe we need to pay more, we as a community need to pay more attention to the test takers' experiences.
Great. Thank you, Elena. And Sergey, any comments?
I think this is not directly answering the question. I think the question was asking, like, what can we add beyond the GPA or beyond just a straightforward way we have been assessing people with AI. And I think, not sure that necessarily AI has a major role to, but certainly expanding credentialing beyond a GPA-based assessment or some numerical score-based assessment, I think is very important for the type of jobs that we expect to be growing in the future, right? Very creative kind of knowledge economy. It's not whether you know something or not, it's potentially just you have to demonstrate that you're able to create new things, right? And that's hard to assess and it's somewhat subjective. But I also think that the tendency is to think, how can AI help or interact directly with the student? And another way to think about it is, how can the AI make the instructor 10x as effective or 100 times as effective or 1,000 times as effective as instructors have been? Because if AI can do that, but we still maintain the instructor-student connection, then maybe that's another way that AI can actually impact students in a huge way. So if each instructor, everything else constant, if every instructor in the world is able to spend 10 more hours a week, right, on actually interacting with their students, that's going to increase student outcomes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Jerry. I have another question about privacy. The impact of using other people's data, of having a background in their home. We're seeing a lot of complaints about this kind of thing. Why do I have to? Somebody's proctoring me in a test, and you see my kitchen, you see my kids, that kind of thing. how long do you keep my data, those kinds of things. And in terms of large-scale data databases, what do you think about privacy and what those issues are right now? Maybe it's educating the public about how data is being used, but what do you all think? Lena?
From my perspective, especially again coming with this assessment perspective and background, I think we need to be more thoughtful ahead of time of what type of data we actually need and for what purpose. So when I introduced the concept of computational psychometrics, and meaning that we need to think of an integration of artificial intelligence-based methodologies and algorithms within a psychometric framework that supports the validity of either the learning instrument or the assessment instrument. I also emphasize that in a computational psychometric framework, the data collection is intentional, so that there is thought put into what type of data we need, from whom, for what purpose, and for how long. And I believe that this is what we are seeing now in this context of remote proctoring, when we talk with companies that have been active in building these technologies for allowing for this technology to actually, be with people in their house to negotiate and clarify and work with the regulators in the properties of this data and obtain consent from the test takers. So I think we still have probably quite some way to go. I don't think we probably that by now we uncovered all the potential issues, but I've seen quite a lot of progress in the past few months, and I feel quite good about it. Again, it's not perfect, but I see good intentions and I see people being motivated in addressing these issues. But especially this thoughtfulness about what type of data do I need? And that question be asked before, ahead of time. That's my personal opinion on this.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I find this probably the most fascinating part of everything, because on the one hand, we have, people, including partly myself or my kids, who put out everything on TikTok. Well, not anymore, but they used to put out everything on TikTok, and anything will be on Facebook. If you're over 50 or whatever, anything will be, on various platforms. And then on the other hand, we get all in it, all sort of like, oh my God, but now there's all this stuff out there, and it kind of is coming back to haunt us. All these years of putting stuff out, and all our faces are everywhere, etc. So I think that this is really kind of a watershed moment, and I couldn't agree more with Alina about being intentional about data collection. And I would even argue that doing good AI is something that I think Bob Misleffy has been talking about for, 30 years with this evidence-centered design framework. And it is about, being intentional with data collection, having an evidentiary chain of reasoning. And that really should be what it's about. And maybe we should apply that also to Facebook algorithms and to TikTok videos that we get to see. But it is that being very intentional about it, and also being very clear about what you use the data for, so that nobody is basically being unfairly treated in that, and thinks that they're sharing one thing and they end up sharing something very different. Be radically transparent about why you are asking someone for something, or why you're collecting this data, and that is, to me, good ECD. And it's sometimes depressing that we haven't gone as far with applying ECD consistently across the whole industry, which we haven't. But as Alina said, I think there's reason for optimism, as you see more and more even funders of startups saying, like, you know what, we actually want to see that kind of evidence, because we know that users want to see that evidence. Going back to Life's point about users having more choice and becoming more vocal consumers, that actually becomes a real asset as opposed to an extra headache for later.
Yeah, if I could just pick up on that, if it's all right for a second. I do think that, you know, we are dealing with predictable outcomes associated with early abundant enthusiasm about the power of AI. And there is obviously a natural pushback against scenarios which a number of you have actually indicated, you know, we haven't actually gotten right, and that's caused all kinds of challenges in the marketplace. I do think that equally predictable is that the marketplace will mature, and as long as there are principles that can be established and broadly adopted. So, for example, at ASU, you know, we do privacy by design. Our mobile app, for example, which does a huge amount of data collection, starts with actually privacy is turned on. And if you want us to know things about your geolocation or any of your behaviors, you actually have to turn it on. In other words, you have to be willing to give away a little bit of your privacy in order to get the proposed value. Not only do you have to do it once, you actually have to do it every 30 days. So again, whether that's the standard or some other standard evolves, I think if we start with privacy by design, and we help to educate, especially in the education marketplace, the proposed link between data gathering, and as has been suggested, not just anything, but rather, I think Elena said it earlier on, a thoughtful reflection about why collecting certain kinds of data will help us. And yes, we know that machines can consume all data, and we might, quote unquote, be surprised by, you know, what the machine comes back and tells us is, you know, a version of our version of Freakonomics in terms of the, you know, a determinant of consequence to learning outcomes. But we, you know, we do have lots of good learning theory. We have a lot of engagement theory, and, you know, we can move this into a more mature engagement with students and their families and so forth. I think by taking a privacy by design and then being very explicit about the ways in which we intend to use, and being very clear. And again, we've been doing this, especially during COVID, you know, how long do you hold your data, the data for? And is it indeed fully anonymized? And so forth. So I think those being explicit are really important.
Thank you, Lev. Sergey, you have any comments?
About privacy?
Yeah, about privacy, yeah.
I believe I shared them.
Okay, sure. All right. We had another question, and I think it's an important question. In terms of the, have any of you in your companies made a transition from the summative assessment to a dynamic, more formative approach for assessments where you're, you know, maybe you don't have a summative test way down at the end of the street here, but you're giving, you're evaluating the learning, and you're also using the new learning sciences and instrumentation, that kind of thing, to evaluate students' success.
I can get started. I think, you know, if I'm thinking about Duolingo went sort of the other direction, right? And started with a learning environment and ended up with a Highstakes test. And I think Gradescope has always been sort of in that space to sort of support it. You know, ETS has had a long history. I mean, there's no denying that of Highstakes tests, and we still do. I think what's currently is happening is maybe due to COVID, maybe due to just general change in needs of people, is this push towards, okay, that's great, that score, and it's useful for certain cases, but how can we pull that apart and how can we set up students for success? And so we've been building these research labs that essentially are all about that. They're about how do we, for example, our speech radar engine, well-known engine, has a lot of great features underneath it that we always sum up to this one score, but there's so much that you can pull apart and put into an app for learning how to speak, which is one of the hardest things that often students have when they learn a language is the speaking part. And so we've been working very hard on developing a lot more around writing, helping students write more and be more reflective writers, and you know, and having an app out there on the Google you know, Doc system to essentially, when you write your paper, you press a button, you get it in there, and it actually helps you. It is not about, here are all the mistakes you make. No, think about this, think about that. It is truly that interactive writing, so that the point when you get to working with a teacher, that teacher can really focus on the specific things that you are struggling with, as opposed to trying to teach a whole classroom one thing. And so it even lets you pull out a teacher report, so that a teacher can say like, oh, hey, this is, so-and-so are struggling with this, and we're going to focus on that. So I think that is what we're focusing on, like 100%. It's important that we have these assessments. It's especially important for understanding what, for example, the impact of COVID has been and things like that. But then how do we pull apart from that and really focus on setting up learners for success? So that's what we're doing.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have about 2.5 minutes, I think, left. Anybody else have any comments about this integration almost between learning and assessment that we're seeing? It's becoming more of a pathway for learners, I think. That is maybe more effective. I don't know. Is it more effective than summative tests? I don't know.
Well, we do have a huge amount of data, again, that we use in a student success algorithm and predictive model, which is really based on engagement and time on task. And it is as powerful a predictor as any other set of variables to students' persistence to completion. And it's not the only thing that one cares about, but certainly in a public university, that's hugely important. And so we've been measuring that, as I say, well, significantly for the last half a dozen years. We do that through our learning management system, which we, of course, mine for all of the values related to student success, including that one.
Great, thank you, Liv.
And at Duolingo, we use time on task and engagement, but we are also, my colleagues actually from other division, they are also looking at the curve for forgetting and trying out different curves and then building showing the learner the older type of information according to this curve. So having a personalized approach to learning is related to feedback, and it's related to feedback in real time to help the learner succeed. So, Sergey, I don't know if you want to comment on that. I know you've been doing quite a lot in this area.
It's a goal of ours to be informed by research, but it's also a goal of ours to do features that our users ask for. And